Welcome to Algebra 1, Unit 7, Lesson 13 Practice Problems. We'll start with 3 vocabulary terms. The first is completing the square. Completing the square in a quadratic expression means transforming it into the form a times x plus p squared minus q, where a, p, and q are constants. Completing the square in a quadratic expression means transforming it into the form a times the quantity of x plus p squared minus q. The next vocabulary term is perfect square. A perfect square is an expression that is something times itself. Usually, we are interested in situations where the something is a rational number or an expression with rational coefficients. And the third vocabulary term is rational number. A rational number is a fraction or the opposite of a fraction. Remember that a fraction is a point on the number line that you can get by dividing the unit interval into b equal parts and finding the point that is a of them from 0. We can always write a fraction in the form a over b, where a and b are whole numbers with b not equal to 0. But there are other ways to write them. For example, 0.7 is a fraction because it is the point on the number line you get by dividing the unit interval into 10 equal parts and finding the point that is 7 of those parts away from 0. We can also write this number as 7 over 10. The numbers 3, negative 3 over 4, and 6.7 are all rational numbers. The numbers pi and negative square root of 2 are not rational numbers because they cannot be written as fractions or their opposites. Add the number that would make the expression a perfect square. Next, write an equivalent expression in factored form. So for number 1, we're going to take the 3 and divide it by 2, which equals 3 halves. Now we're going to take 3 halves and we're going to square it, which equals 9 fourths. So we would add 9 fourths, and then our factored form would be x plus 3 halves squared. Number 2. We're going to take the 0.6 and we're going to divide it by 2. That gives us 0.3. Then we're going to take 0.3 and square it, and that gives us 0.9. So now we're going to add 0.9. That gives us our standard form, and then our factored form would be x plus the 0.3 that we found squared. Number 3. We're going to take the negative 11 and we're going to divide it by 2. And that gives us negative 11 halves. Then we're going to take the negative 11 halves and square it, and that gives us 121 over 4. So we will add 121 over 4 to get the standard form, and then our factored form would be x minus 11 halves squared. Number 4. We're going to take the negative 5 halves and we're going to divide that by 2. That becomes negative 5 halves times 1 half, which gives us negative 5 fourths. Now we'll take that negative 5 fourths and we'll square it, which will give us 25 over 16. So the number that we're going to add is the negative 5 fourths, or I'm sorry, the 25 over 16. But when we write it as factored form, it'll be x minus 5 fourths squared. And finally, number 5, we're going to take 1 and divide it by 2. That gives us 1 half. Now we're going to take that 1 half and square it, which equals 1 fourth. So we're going to add 1 half to make our standard form, and then our factored form will be x plus 1 half squared. If you have any questions about how to use completing the square to write the standard form and the factored form, please ask for clarification now so that you are prepared as we move on to the next practice problem. Bottom of page 1. Noah is solving the equation x squared plus 8x plus 15 equals 3. He begins by rewriting the expression on the left in factored form and writes x plus 3 times x plus 5 equals 3. He does not know what to do next. Noah knows that the solutions are x equals negative 2 and x equals negative 6, but is not sure how to get these values from his equation. Solve the original equation by completing the square. So we're going to start with the original equation, x squared plus 8x plus 15 equals 3. If we are doing completing the square, the first thing we're going to do is move the c term to the other side. So we're going to subtract 15 from both sides. This gives us x squared plus 8x equals negative 12. Now we need to take the b term, which is 8, and we need to divide it by 2. And that gives us 4. Now we're going to square 4 and we get 16. This is what we're going to add to both sides. Now we have x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals positive 4. When we factor the left side, we get x plus 4 squared equals 4. Now we want to take the square root of both sides, and if we take the square root of something that is being squared, we're left with what's inside, x plus 4. And when we take the square root of 4, that means x plus 4 could be 2, or x plus 4 could be negative 2. In both cases, we subtract 4 on both sides. 2 minus 4 is negative 2, and negative 2 minus 4 is negative 6. So now we've used completing the square and shown that Noah is correct. The answers are negative 2 and negative 6. If you have any questions about completing the square, please ask for clarification now so that you're prepared when we move on to the next practice problem. Top of page 2. An equation and its solutions are given. Explain or show how to solve the equation by completing the square. So number 1, we have x squared plus 20x plus 50 equals 14. The first step is to move the c term to the other side. So now we have x squared plus 20x. I'm going to leave a space, and it equals negative 36. We take 20 and divide it by 2, and that equals 10. Then we take 10 and we square it, and that equals 100. So now we're going to add 100 to both sides. When we factor the left side, we're going to have x plus 10 squared. And on the right side, negative 36 plus 100 equals 64. When we take the square root of both sides, we get x plus 10 equals 8, or x plus 10 equals negative 8. In both cases, we subtract 10 from both sides. And x either equals negative 2 or x equals negative 18, and that matches the answers they told us we should get. In number 2, we have x squared plus 1.6x equals 0.36. We take the 1.6 and we divide it by 2, and we get 0.8. Then we take 0.8 and we square it, and we get 0.64. So we're going to add 0.64 to both sides. When we factor the left, we're going to have x plus 0.8 squared. And on the right, 0.36 and 0.64 add to 1. Now we take the square root on both sides, and we get x plus 0.8 equals 1, or x plus 0.8 equals negative 1. In both cases, we subtract 0.8 from both sides. And that tells us x either equals 0.2 or x equals negative 1.8. And if we look, that matches the answers they told us we should get. And finally, number 3, we have x squared minus 5x equals 11 over 4. We're going to take the negative 5 and divide it by 2, and that gives us negative 5 halves. Now, if we take negative 5 halves and we square it, we get 25 over 4. So that's what we're going to add to both sides. Next, we can factor the left side, and we'll have x minus 5 halves squared. And on the right side, when we add 11 fourths plus 25 fourths, we will have 36 fourths. 36 divided by 4 is 9, so this becomes x minus 5 halves squared equals 9. Then we take the square root of both sides, and when we take the square root of something being squared, we're left with x minus 5 halves. And when we take the square root of 9, we get positive 3, or x minus 5 halves equals negative 3. We add 5 halves to both sides of both equations. And we get x equals 5.5, or x equals negative 1/2. And that matches what they have here. 5.5 is the same as 11 halves. So we've used completing the square to prove that the solutions are correct. If you have any questions about how to use completing the square, please use class time to ask for further clarification. The last problem for lesson 13. Solve each equation. As we look at number 1, we want to use the negative 0.5, that is the b term, and we want to divide it by 2. So if we take negative 0.5 and we divide it by 2, we get negative 0.25. That is what will go inside our factor. To know what we're adding, we need to take this negative 0.25 and square it. And that equals 0.0625. That is what we're going to add to both sides. So x minus 0.25 squared equals 0.5625. So now we need to take the square root of both sides. If you take the square root of something being squared, you just end up with what's inside. When we take the square root of 5.5625, we're going to get positive 0.75 and negative 0.75. So now we're going to add 0.25 on both sides of both equations. Once we do that, our first answer becomes x equals 1, and our second answer becomes x equals negative 0.5. So we have found the two answers to number 1. In number 2, we're going to do the same thing. We have x squared plus 0.8x, leave a space, and that equals 0.09. We're going to use the 0.8 and divide it by 2. That equals 0.4. That's what will go in our factor, x plus 0.4 squared. Now we're going to take 0.4 and we're going to square it, and that will be 0.16. So that's what we're going to add to both sides. So now the x plus 0.4 squared is going to equal 0.25. Next, we will take the square root of both sides. When you take the square root of something being squared, you're left with what's inside. So x plus 0.4 equals positive 0.5, or x plus 0.4 equals negative 0.5. We will subtract 0.4 from both sides on both equations. Our first answer becomes x equals 0.1. Our second answer becomes x equals negative 0.9. And for number 3, we're going to follow the same method. We have x squared plus 13 over 3x, and that's going to equal 56 over 36. We will take 13 over 3 and divide it by 2, which becomes 13 over 3 times 1/2, which becomes 13 over 6. This is what will be inside the factoring. So we will have x plus 13 over 6 squared equals. Now we're going to take the 13 over 6 and we're going to square it. "13 squared is 169, so this becomes 169 over 36. That's what we're going to add to both sides. Now we'll move this over to have a little bit of space. So now we add the 169 over 36 to both sides, and this becomes 56 plus 169 is 225. So now we can take the square root of both sides, and we find out that x plus 13 over 6 equals 15 over 6, or x plus 13 over 6 equals negative 15 over 6. We're going to subtract 13 over 6 from both sides of both equations. So our first answer would be x equals 2 over 6, which equals 1/3. Or our second answer is that x equals negative 28 over 6, which equals negative 14 over 3. If you have any questions about anything we've done on the Lesson 13 practice problems, please ask for clarification so that you are better prepared going into Lesson 14.